None can stand before the armor of chaos. Certainly not Nurgles. So let's talk tactics on Plagueburst Crawlers.
Anvil of War! Let's talk tactics!
Hey guys, we're here today to talk tactics on the Death Guard iconic tank, the Cheese Loaf, the Plagueburst Crawler. These tanks are absolutely phenomenal in games of Warhammer 40,000, and I brought my 3 tanks here today to talk to you a little bit about what I like about them and why I think they're one of the best tanks in the game. So looking at their stat line, they are a bit slower of a vehicle, which is a trait, brandished by Nurgle. We are tougher naturally, but we do lack the kind of mobility that most armies have with their vehicles. They only have a 9-inch movement trait, which is fine. You only lose 3 inches, but they are toughness 8, which is key because that makes them so much harder to wound against. Anything that's kind of like strength 8 shooting, it's just now you're wounding them on 4s. They do have 4+ ballistic skill and weapon skill, which admittedly is not that good, but they have some excellent war gear options, which we'll talk about in just a minute. These guys have 3 attacks in combat, which you don't want them to be in combat. But being toughness 8 with 12 wounds is heavy duty, especially for the fact that they have a 5-up invuln save, and then you have your 5-up disgustingly resilient. These guys do explode on a 5+, which makes them kind of a little different from most vehicles exploding on 6s, but it is D3 mortal wounds to everybody within 6 inches. That can put out mortal wounds if they get in combat, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. War gear options. These guys have a hull-mounted weapon, and they have 2 sponsons. So the core kind of unit that you're going to see with a Plagueburst Crawler is you can take sponsons that are flamers, and you can take a hull-mounted weapon that is either a longer range or a shorter range weapon. For free, you have the Plagueburst Mortar included on top, which is an excellent long-range weapon that doesn't require line of sight. So let's talk a little bit about these weapons. We have the flamers on the side, which are your plague spitters. Now, you see these on the fetid bloat drones. Well, the Plagueburst Crawlers can take them too. This is really interesting for a tank because unless you have those kind of Blood Angels tanks or the Space Marine Loyalists, you don't really get to see a lot of auto-hitting weapons on tanks. So Plagueburst Crawlers, can take plague spitters, which come in at strength user, which is strength 7 on a tank. Now that's a pretty heavy-duty flamer. AP -1, damage 1, but it is a plague weapon, so it's reroll 1s to wound. I love that. It's a great weapon. It's got 9-inch flamer range. It's pretty excellent on a Plagueburst Crawler, but that means you're going to be moving your Plagueburst Crawlers around, which kind of goes in an opposite direction for their other weapons. Now you have the Plagueburst Mortar, which is heavy D6. It doesn't require line of sight, and it has 48-inch range. Now, I think it's kind of interesting because the mortar cannot shoot at units within 12-inch range, so it actually has a minimum weapon distance, which you don't see on a lot of things in games of Warhammer 40,000, but it's kind of cool. This is great for picking off guys that are out of line of sight, things like Thunderfire cannons or scouts or what have you that are kind of hiding away. It's strength 8, AP -2, damage D3. So it's a heavy-duty weapon, but it is hitting on 4s, and it is heavy, so if you move with it, you become an orc. Other sponsored weapon you can take is the Entropy Cannon, which is also strength 8. It's AP -4, which is huge against enemy vehicles for sure, and it's damage D6. It is only 36-inch range, so I honestly think it's kind of like a poor man's las cannon, but believe it or not, it's cheaper than taking the flamer sponsons. So this can give your Death Guard kind of a nice mid-range heavy firepower with the Plagueburst Crawler tank. Especially if it sits still, you still have the Plagueburst Mortar to shoot with it. The hull-mounted weapon can be one of 2 things. It is a 36-inch range heavy 4 at strength 5, AP -1, 1 damage. Now, that's kind of a heavy bolter, right? You can also take a 24-inch range AP -2, strength 6 gun, which is kind of interesting, but it's a little bit more expensive by about 10 points, so you won't see a lot of it because it is heavy as well, and if you're moving forward with it, what's the point? I think taking the base one with the 36-inch range is a little bit better, in my opinion. Now, obviously, flamers, I think, are a very interesting choice, but you have to look at your Plagueburst Crawlers and think, what do I want to do with this tank? Do I want to make it a long-range firepower thing, or do I want to move in on my opponents and flame them and potentially explode these tanks very aggressively? that's something you need to decide as a player. All right, so let's talk about some unit synergies that we can bring to make our Plagueburst Crawlers even better. Now, coming in at 140 points, these tanks are quite cheap for what they do. So this kind of gives you some play with some of the HQ options that you want to bring to benefit your Plagueburst Crawlers. First out the gate, that I think is included in every Death Guard army, is your Demon Prince. Now, why the Demon Prince is good, because he does allow reroll 1, so if you're going to do the ranged option kind of with your Plagueburst Crawlers, he can hide inside the tanks, and that's a very heavy duty screen for them to try to get through to get to your Demon Prince. He's great at digging them out of melee. If in the event they get locked up, the Demon Prince is there to help. But the main thing is you can take the Arc Contaminator Warlord trait. Now this is going to allow you to reroll all failed wound rolls with plague weapons. Now, keeping in mind the Plague Spitter Sponsons and the Plagueburst Mortar are plague weapons. That's huge, right? Plagueburst Mortars can be wounding tanks and stuff on 3s and 4s, and then you're rerolling all of those as opposed to just your 1s. Then you got your Flamers, which, you know, maybe you're wounding a vehicle on a 5 and a 6, but you get that full reroll. It's huge. You can get a lot more damage out of it. Demon Prince is good for that, but you do kind of have to take that specific Warlord trait to kind of do it. But if you are going with more of like the Entropy Cannons and the Heavy Sluggers, he's allowing you to reroll your 1s too, so that makes your shooting a little bit more effective. So another great unit to buff your Plagueburst Crawler tanks is none other than the Poxbringer from the Chaos Demons Codex. Now, this is called Chaos Soup when you bring in another unit from another codex, but I like to do it because all Death Guard vehicles can get buffed by this guy, because he gives all Nurgle demons within 6 inches +1 strength. We talked about it a little bit earlier that the Plague Spitters on the sponsons for the Plagueburst Crawlers are strength user. That means they're strength 7. With this guy, they become strength 8. Huge on Flamers, because all of a sudden you have 8-inch flamer or 9-inch Flamers at strength 8. That's nutty, especially against vehicles, especially against knights, any kind of heavy toughness thing. All of a sudden your Flamers don't care. But also against infantry, that means you're wounding Space Marines on 2s, and you don't need the Arc Contaminator because you're rerolling 1s anyways, being a plague weapon. That's great, I think. So while also including this guy, you can consider taking the psychic ability called Fleshy Abundance. Now that is D3 wounds back on a Nurgle demon within 18 inches. That means he's like a psychic tech marine for the Plagueburst Crawlers. He can put wounds back on them. This can grief your opponents to no end, because these tanks are very hard to kill as is, and now when you're putting wounds back on them, healing them, oh, it's just great. Watch their faces kind of drop. You know, maybe it's sadistic, but I love it. So yeah, other than that, we have a couple stratagems that we can use on these tanks. One of them being Revolting Regeneration, so you can D3 wounds back on for 2 command points. I think this is situational, like you do have the spell access, which I think is better than spending all your command points to try to keep your Plagueburst Crawlers alive, but let's say you flub that roll, you really need this tank to make it to the next turn. I would consider spending 2 command points to bring it back. It could certainly help. Another great thing that you can do, because the Plagueburst Crawler tanks can dish out mortal wounds when they explode, is Putrid Detonation. Putrid Detonation is great because there is no roll, they just automatically explode. Now if you're running up the board with those Flamers and you're in your opponent's face and they're just like, I have to deal with this tank, and they shoot it and it explodes, all of a sudden you're able to dish out mortal wounds to a majority of his army. And that can really hurt your opponent, especially when you're kind of going in with these suicide tanks. It's a lot of fun, and people don't expect it, right? Because they're like, oh, what about the Plagueburst Mortar? What about the Plagueburst Mortar? It's like, it's free. You know, that's not the point. It's all about the Flamers now. So I like to kind of spice it up. You can do some Flamer tanks. You could have one sit in the back with the Entropy Cannons and kind of provide that heavy firepower. And he's not going to draw a lot of fire because they're going to be dealing with the tanks that are running at them with the Flamers. It is a little bit harder to buff them with the Poxbringer when you do that, because he only has 6-inch movement and they have 9. So he's trying to, usually you're using your advanced rolls to try to keep up and buff their Flamer attacks because they're so good. Other than that, their major weakness is the fact that they cannot shoot and fall back. There is a way around this. If you were to get the Feculent Gnarlmoth fortifications from the Chaos Demons Codex, more soup. Nurgle demons that can fall back to the trees can shoot and charge. So this could be cool with Plagueburst Crawler tanks, especially. because their flamers you could be falling back, flaming, you know, it can get crazy at 2d6 automatic hits with your Plagueburst Crawler tank. So try not to get them tied up. Like, I like to include a little bit of a screen in the army to kind of, you know, ensure that they get a couple shooting attacks in, because admittedly they're just not that good in melee. But that's where the Demon Prince can kind of get them unstuck, especially if it's like a lot of infantry, and you know, Plagueburst Crawler's got 3 attacks, so it's never going to make it, especially hitting on 4s. Yeah, so that's how I would run my Plagueburst Crawlers. I like running 3 of them just because why not? You know, they're only 140 points each. They're an excellent spearhead detachment for the Death Guard Codex if you wanted to bring that. And they do have some war gear options that allow them to either be long range or in your face, kind of flaming you. So if you guys like this video, please subscribe for more Nurgle content, and thanks for watching.
Sponsored by...
So thank you guys for watching that video today, and for the Dark Gods, please smash that subscribe button down below and see which boon of chaos you will get there at home in your seat. It's called... oh, I don't remember. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this now. So cut here.